Hi everyone, good to have you here. I am so glad that you made time to be with us. My name is Esther Kihanga from the US Embassy team here in Nairobi and representing a very special unit in the public diplomacy section, which is American Center Nairobi, which is part of a larger network of American Spaces Kenya. If you're new to any of our programs, Karibu sana. Please feel free to drop a comment on the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. Tell us which institution you represent. We'd be happy to get to know you. Thank you to everyone who's already saying hi. Glad to see you here. Let me tell you a little bit about American Spaces Kenya, which is really an exciting thing for you to take note of. We've got corners across this country. We've got presence in Nairobi at Moi University, Nairobi, right in the heart of the city. We've got a space right in KNLS building in Nakuru. If you're from that corner, please check it out. If you're in Lamu, we have a space there as well. And if you're in Mombasa, you can check out American Corner Mombasa. We also have presence on Facebook. So find us as American Corner Mombasa, American Corner Nakuru, American Corner Lamu, American Corner Moi University. So once again, I'm so delighted to have you here today. I want to just play a quick video so you get to know how big a network this is, how big a family you are checking into, because we've got more than 600 locations across the world. So allow me to share this video in just a little bit.
In 90 years, American Spaces have shared America's stories through unique physical locations worldwide.
There's over 600 locations in 142 countries.
Our American centers, American corners, and binational centers may be housed in schools, libraries, or even theaters.
But one defining component never changes: the people.
We are the first point of contact that people around the world have with the United States.
And last year, more than 65 million people visited American Spaces.
American Spaces promote U.S. foreign policy by conducting strategic cultural programming that provides foreign audiences the opportunity to experience American culture, media, and technology.
By doing so, we give people around the world their first experience with the U.S., address media literacy, counter violent extremism, and promote economic stability.
The Office of American Spaces is made up of contractors, civil servants, Foreign Service generalists, and specialists.
Hosted in DC and 23 strategic locations around the world.
We possess a wide range of skills,
come from interesting and diverse backgrounds,
provide training and guidance in the field,
and we love what we do.
American Spaces are and have always been
places where people learn and share ideas,
express their thoughts, often while learning English,
and learn about what it means to be an American and create mutual understanding.
American Spaces connect the world with the United States.
Fantastic. As you've heard, American Spaces connect the world with the United States. So if you'd like to learn more about the US, if you'd like to learn English language or more specific programs like STEM aligned programs, please get in touch with us. This is Earth Day. I hope you know that. We're really excited about that. It's such a crucial conversation to be having in this day and age that we need to take care of the environment. And today we thought to speak about something that may not be overly familiar to a lot of people, but I know if you're Kenyan and you're joining us on this call, when we talk about invasive species, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is locusts, yeah, because we've been seeing videos and news clippings about that. But we want to expand your knowledge a little bit more, and that's why we have a special guest joining us. But I'll let my colleague Devin Glick tell you more about it. Devin, karibu sana.
Asante, Esther, and good morning to everyone here in Zoom with us. I'm really happy that you could all join us. Thank you to my colleague Esther, who is our American Spaces Coordinator for Kenya. My name is Devin Glick, and I am a Public Diplomacy Officer at the US Embassy in Nairobi. And so we have people commenting in there in the chat. We're from all over Kenya, We have lots of students here, lots of university students and other members of the community. For those of you who are joining an American Center program for the very first time, welcome, and we hope you stick around and take part in many more. And today is tomorrow is Earth Day, I think, right? But it's Earth Week, it's Earth Month, it's Earth Year. We're all about protecting the environment, and I think the United States is committed to working with our international partners around the world to protect our environment, to combat climate change, and this is our Earth. You know, that's environment is something that knows no boundaries. It doesn't follow any political divisions with or borders. So it is vitally important that Americans and Kenyans and Africans and Europeans, we all work together to help protect and preserve our environment for future generations. And so with that, I want to pass it over to our expert speaker today. Goodness knows I'm not the expert on environment. And I will introduce our speaker, who is Rachel Neville. She led the Oahu Invasive Species Committee from 2007 to 2012, and again from 2015 to 2019. And for those of you who do not know, Oahu is an island in the beautiful state of Hawaii. And the committee is part of a network of organizations working to reduce invasive species numbers in each county of the state of Hawaii. During her time at OISC, the Oahu Invasive Species Committee, she led the island's multi-agency response to a novel forest pathogen, directed a program to eradicate several species of invasive plants that threatened Oahu's unique ecosystems, and worked on issues surrounding biocontrol and statewide invasive species policy. She has a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in Russian language and area studies. And so with that, I will pass it over to Rachel, and thank you for joining us. Over to you, Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited there's so many people here to talk about invasive species. This is the first time I'm doing, whoa, that's not what was supposed to happen. This is the first time I'm doing this, so let me find my presentation. So Devin, it's not giving me.
If you, I can just share from my side and I'll control the.
Yeah, maybe that's best because it won't let me get into my computer to find the file. Sorry.
No problem.
I'll put it on Google Drive next time.
Here we go. And then let me put it into presentation mode. Let's start at the beginning. Can you see that? Does that work? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So they had told me that you guys would be interested in hearing about careers in international relations. And so I structured this talk around how a career in invasive species is an international career. And I'm going to use a case study for a invasive species that is a problem in both Kenya and Hawaii to kind of illustrate that point. But first, though, I am very new to Kenya. I've only been here for 2 months. This is the state of Hawaii. This is a satellite picture. And the second island from the top, that's Oahu. That's the island that I'm from. Next slide. And then just so you know where Hawaii is in the world, we're right in the middle of the Pacific. So you can probably see that word that says Honolulu. So that's Hawaii. So we're very isolated. Next slide. So before I came to Kenya, I was the manager of the Oahu Invasive Species Committee. And so OISC was started in 2001 by a group of volunteers who were concerned about the spread of invasive plants on Oahu Island. And many of those volunteers are still on our steering committee today. So that's really nice to have that historical knowledge. So now we started off with 3 staff, and now we have a field crew of about 10. This is the field crew here holding the leaves of one of our target species. It's called Myconia calvescens. And so the field crew basically goes through, we have a list of target species that we're trying to remove from the island, and the field crew will go in the forest to people's houses and yards, even into the city if that's where the species are, and remove them. We also have a outreach program to support all that. OISC is a part of the University of Hawaii, but it kind of operates like a nonprofit or an NGO in that it has to raise all of its operating funds through grants. Next slide. So you guys are probably familiar with what invasive species are if you are attending this talk, but just so you know kind of how I define them. So organisms that are imported into a new place, become abundant and cause problems in the environment, public health, or agriculture, or even just quality of life too, or I mean, anything that causes problems. Next slide. And of course, I'm most familiar with terrestrial plants, but invasive species can be aquatic plants, insects, animals, fish, any kind of marine organism, and plant and animal diseases. This picture here is that brown stuff that is an invasive seaweed that is smothering coral reefs off the coast of Oahu. Next slide. So when I found out I was coming to Kenya, I started doing research on the invasive species issues here. And I was surprised to see how many plant species are considered invasive in both Kenya and Hawaii. It makes sense because we're both tropical regions, but it's also, this is not even a complete list. This is what I could fit on the slide. There's actually many more plants that we share in common. Next slide. So how do we control invasive plants? There's kind of 2 broad categories. The first is chemical and mechanical control. And so that means surveying for plants and either cutting them down or hand pulling them out of the ground or applying pesticide. And then if that doesn't work, or if your plant is too widespread, you're probably going to be thinking about introducing natural enemies from the species native range, and that's called biocontrol. And the advantages of biocontrol are it's kind of expensive up front, but once you release a natural enemy, it kind of does the work for you. And so you don't have to, and it's also, you don't have to use herbicide, which is nice. The drawback is if you're using biocontrol, you're never going to get rid of the invasive species completely. It will reduce the population, hopefully to the point at which it doesn't cause problems, but you won't ever completely get rid of it. Next slide. Okay, so our case study is Chromaline Odorata. This is a problem in many countries in the world. In Kenya, it looks like it's just starting to get into Kenya from what I read. And it's a big problem in South Africa, in Western Africa, and also in Tanzania. There was one, so what it does is it's very aggressive and it grows faster than the plants around it. And it forms dense thickets that crowd out all the other plants. So, and it's very adaptable. So it can, like in Hawaii, it's invading forests, like montane forests. In South Africa and Tanzania, it's invading farms and grasslands. So it has a very wide range of climates that it can do well in. There was a study in South Africa, or I'm sorry, yeah, South Africa that showed a pasture invaded by Chromaline, the number of cattle that pasture could support was reduced by 75%. So, you know, if you have 100 hectares of pasture or grassland, and Chromalina moves in, all of a sudden you only have 25 acres. So that's a real problem for people raising livestock. It's a problem for farmers, but it's also a real environmental problem because if this weed moves into national parks and or conservancies, there's going to be a lot less grass for both livestock and wild animals. Next slide. Okay, so this is the this map. The black areas show where Chromalina has invaded, and the gray areas are where Chromalina is native to. So what happened in Hawaii was around 2011. Chromalina was discovered in a forested area actually by the US Army's environmental program. And because it was, it had a lot of notoriety already because it had invaded a lot of other countries, it was on a list that, so we were looking for it. It was a big problem in Guam, which is another Pacific island to the west of Hawaii. And there's a lot of troop movements between Guam and Hawaii. And so the US Army was on the lookout for it to, because it seemed like there would be a high chance that it could get introduced to Hawaii. And so one of the ways in which invasive species is an international career is usually the first thing you do when you find a new species is you start talking to scientists from other countries. So you want to talk to scientists who are in the native range of the species that you're concerned about, because you want to find out how the species behaves in its native range. And then you also want to talk to scientists that have already dealt with the species in countries where it's already invaded. So my colleague, who's the one who found Chromalina, she talked to people in Australia and Africa and Southeast Asia and said, hey, so we just found this, how bad is it? And they pretty much all said, this is the worst thing you're ever going to have. You need to do something about it right now. So, so that's what we did. Next slide. So we started a program of chemical mechanical control, and that was so surveys. And when you talk about control for OISC, because we're often dealing with wildlands and natural areas, surveys are where you spend the most time and the most resources. So it's actually finding this one plant among all the other plants. And then the crew would either hand pull or apply herbicide if there was a lot of plants. They would have to use herbicide. And then we also started an outreach program. And with any invasive species program, you do want to make sure you have an outreach component, because you want people to tell you when they find new populations of the species that you're looking for. And you also want them to support your efforts to control it. Next slide. So this is a map that shows the basically the story of Chromalina on Oahu. And so the red dots at the top, Kahuku, that's where it was first discovered in 2011. And then it moved down to Aiea, where the yellow dots are. And then over, if you look to the west, Makaha, that's the blue dots. It moved over there. The other dots are kind of more single plants that were found. So we started to feel like we were chasing the species across the islands. And I have to say, so the wrinkly parts of this, of the island, so those are mountain ranges. And of all the plants that I've dealt with at OISC, and even plants that I've read about, I haven't ever seen a plant that was able to move this far, this fast. Most of our species, they'll expand their footprint. So there'll be a small group of plants, and if you don't take care of it, they'll kind of creep out from the center. Chromalina just jumped over mountain ranges. I had never seen that before. And also, the different parts. So Kahuku is really wet, Kahana is really wet, Aiea and Makaha are actually fairly dry. And so the climates that Chromalina can survive in is it has a really wide range. It seems like it can survive in almost anything. And so the pink dots so if you go back to the top of the island, the pink dots at Pupukea, Pamalu, we had found a few there in 2011. There were a few plants there that were pulled, but then we got reports from hikers that there was a much larger population that we hadn't known about. And after we looked at it, we thought, oh, we've only got 10 people. We don't have the resources for this. And so it became clear that a program of just surveys and hand pulling and using herbicide was not enough to keep the population of this weed down. Next slide. So that's when we decided to use biocontrol, and biocontrol is really, is pretty much always international, right? Because you're looking for, looking in another country for a predator that has evolved with the species that you want to get rid of. And a lot of times, if you're dealing with new species, that means that you have to go to the other country and collect a bunch of insects and then bring them back. So the Hawaii Department of Agriculture had a position, and the title was Foreign Exploratory Entomologist. And it was this person's job to go to other countries and collect potential biocontrols for things that we were having problems with in Hawaii and to bring them back. And I know we actually had, there was another plant pest that was really bad in Hawaii that was attacking one of our native trees. And the exploratory entomologist went to Tanzania to look for predators and bring some back. So, so after you find your potential biocontrols, of course, you have to do quarantine testing. And so that means making sure that the insects you brought back are only going to attack the plant that you're interested in, and it's not going to jump to another species. And that can take several years. Sometimes that can even take up to a decade. And then there's release and monitoring to make sure that it actually works. Sometimes they release biocontrols and it turns out that they're just not great dispersers, or they don't like the climate and they don't work very well, but sometimes they do work very well. What we did in Hawaii, because Chromaline was so, had already become a problem in other countries, there was a guy in Australia that had found a biocontrol that worked really well. And so we were going to pay for him to come to Hawaii, bring the biocontrol with him, and then help show us how to help rear the insect and tell us anything else we needed to know about quarantine testing. And the insect had already been tested on a lot of different plants in Australia, but we were going to test them on plants that were native to Hawaii. Unfortunately, that was all supposed to happen in 2020. So COVID shut that down. But I think once travel starts again, they'll start that. Hopefully we'll get our biocontrol. Next slide. Okay, so this is another slide so that I can show you how invasive species is an international career. So these are shipping lanes. The yellow lines are shipping lanes across the Pacific, and that big yellow dot in the center, that's Hawaii. So that's part of the reason why we have so many invasive species in Hawaii. So, you know, trade is only going to increase as time goes on. And any trade agreement is probably going to be talking about agriculture. So the shipment of fruits and vegetables and live plants, maybe even animals, between countries. And there's always rules about that. So for example, you know, if you're from another country and you want to ship, say you're from New Zealand, you want to ship apples to the United States, the US Department of Agriculture has a long list of rules that you have to follow to make sure those apples come to the United States without any plant pests or plant diseases on them. And then they have inspectors at ports that open shipments. And if they open a box of fruit and it's got insects or it looks like it might have a disease on it, they'll actually seize that and destroy it. So that means that the exporter has lost money. And I was reading that for some reason, I'm not sure what the organism is, but for some reason, the USDA does not want Kenya to ship fresh green beans to the US. There's some kind of plant pest issue, but there are currently trade talks happening between Kenya and the United States, and the green bean issue is part of those trade talks. So, you know, if you are interested in diplomacy and becoming a diplomat, you're probably going to have to hammer out issues about plant pests while you're dealing with trade negotiations. Next slide. And so just finally, if you're interested in a career in invasive species, there's lots of different ways to be involved with invasive species. So there are, you can be a scientist. And the nice thing about being a scientist is that when you do research, you can help develop new tools to control invasive species. Personally, I don't think we have enough tools to control invasive species. We rely very heavily on herbicides and pesticides. So you see the fourth one down there, the plant pathologist. That is someone that deals with plant diseases. And I can tell you if a plant disease gets into a forest or natural area, there's not a lot you can do. We don't have a vaccine for trees, and we need one. So the nice thing about those is that you can be really active in developing new tools for us to deal with invasive species. I put law on there because, like I said, people that are hammering out treaties and regulations for the movement of live plants are mostly going to be lawyers. Geographic information systems, that refers to mapping software. If you're going to try to control invasive species in a certain area, you need to map it because you need to know where you've surveyed, where the species are popping up, where you've controlled them already. And you can actually get a major in geographic information systems if you want. I put helicopter pilot because we do lots of aerial surveys in Hawaii for invasive plants because a lot of the terrain is too steep for people to climb. It's also faster and cheaper because you can cover more ground. And when you're doing an aerial survey and you have a helicopter pilot that's really interested in plants, it makes the survey a lot nicer. And then my degree is in public administration. And I thought that, so public administration they basically teach you how to effectively run a publicly funded program. I thought it was really helpful for me when I was running OISC, but I will say I haven't seen very many jobs. When I'm looking for jobs, I don't see required masters of public administration. So a lot of times if you're gonna get a public administration degree, you can combine it with something else like forestry or law even. So I think if I could go back in time, that's what I would do. I would do like a forestry public administration degree. So that's just something to think about if you're trying to choose a major and thinking about graduate school. And of course, fundraising, because unfortunately, I haven't come across an organization that's figured out how to make a lot of money out of controlling invasive species. So it's usually publicly funded. So if you know how to raise money, that's always helpful. Next slide. So mahalo is how we say thank you in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian language. So thanks so much for all your attention. And this is, I was talking about Hawaii's native plants. This hibiscus here, that's a Ke'okeo, that's a plant that is only found in Hawaii and one of our native plants. And on the next slide, I have resources for everybody. Yeah, so I would, if you're interested in invasive plants, I would really recommend this guide to the naturalized and invasive plants of Eastern Africa. It's free. It takes like an hour to download it. because it's like 400 pages, but it's got a lot of information on it. And then of course, there's some other links for you guys as well. So I can take questions. Thank you so much for all your attention, and I can take questions now.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm gonna exit the presentation, and we can post some of those resources into the chat. Thank you so much for your presentation. For everybody, I see there's some questions coming into the Q&A. Please feel free to keep sending your questions in through the Q&A, and then we'll go through those in just a second. That was fascinating. I have to say, when you mentioned there's no such thing as a plant vaccine, it really made this presentation really did actually, I saw all these similarities between COVID pandemic and invasive species, thinking about how do we control or how do we do the pathology to find the spread, or how do we limit the spread of these invasive species, just like we're trying to limit the spread of diseases. And I really appreciate that you drew that connection to international diplomacy and how important it is that we learn from other countries, how the United States is learning from how other countries are dealing with the same issues around the world. Let's see, if you don't mind, we'll go straight into some of the questions. So thanks everyone for sending in your questions. We have the first question here from Dennis. How many invasive species have you recorded here in Kenya? And then would you consider using a citizen reporting app for such invasive plants?
That's a great question. So I'm actually not working in Kenya on Kenyan invasive species right now. I'm reading about it, but so like I said, the book that I had recommended you guys look at, I can't remember how many species are in it, but it's 400 pages long. So there's a lot. And also, in Kenya has so many different climates, right? I mean, you have like the coast, you have like Nairobi, you have the montane forests, grasslands. Like there's gonna be species that maybe colonize different ecosystems that you have in Kenya. So I don't know the number, but it's definitely a lot. And the question about using a citizen reporting app, those are great. We did those for, I think right as I was leaving OISC, the outreach specialist was using a reporting app so people could report Chromaline, and we were getting a lot of people reporting incidences of the species to us. So I think, especially like if I was managing a national park, I would definitely want to use one of those, because you could have all the people, like the tour guides and stuff could just be your survey team. So it would really save a lot of time and money.
Thanks, Rachel. And another question from Noreen: are these invasive species harmful to human beings?
So there are a lot of invasive species that are harmful to human beings. So, I mean, human diseases can also be considered invasive species. In Hawaii, we don't have malaria. And so one of the things that the Department of Public Health is on the alert for is the mosquito that carries malaria, and of course the malaria pathogen. Chromaline, the plant I was talking about, is harmful to human beings. I forgot to mention that it's toxic to livestock if they eat it. So that's another problem with it. It also apparently causes allergies. Like if you go in and you're trying to like control it in your field and you get exposed to a lot of it, it can cause respiratory issues.
And we have another question from Jane, who is interested. Can you join OISC as a volunteer? Are there any opportunities to get help?
That's great. Thank you so much. Our outreach specialist will be really excited about that. You can, but the volunteer activities are all on Oahu. So if you move to Hawaii, then you should absolutely sign up as a volunteer, and you can go into the forest and cut down Chromaline.
I would say I think that sounds like an excellent opportunity. Moving to Oahu, I'm sure there's some of us.
I would encourage people, if you're interested, I know I read that Kura Forest has volunteer opportunities to remove lantana camera, because that's a big problem there. I don't know what's probably not with COVID, but maybe if we ever get out of this pandemic, I think there's going to be a lot of volunteer opportunities in Kenya.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know, I think that's a great, like you said, there's a lot of invasive species here in Kenya. So I think getting involved in your own community, I think this is a great way to get involved and help protect the environment. Another question from Anga Ako Nyan is, are all exotic species invasive?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. No, and it's usually a small subset of exotic species that are invasive, right? So like corn is exotic. Corn is native to the Americas, but it is not invasive in in Africa. There are lots of exotic species are perfectly fine. The problem is trying to figure out which one is going to be invasive and which one isn't. And there's a lot of research and science around that, so that if you want to introduce a new species to a place, that it can be safe.
Thanks. And then Eileen noticed that on the list of careers, there was listed gender expert. Let's see, the question is, I see gender expert on the list of career when issues of livelihood and food security are intertwined in this subject. So the question is why? Just curious.
Oh, so I think I didn't put gender expert on that, but you're right. That should probably be on there. I don't know, I'm not sure why this is, but in Hawaii, there are, it was mostly women that were in invasive species. So it seemed really even. So I think we don't actually, at least in Hawaii, we don't think too much about gender, because it's, I think just because it seemed like at least half, if not more, of our colleagues were women. But I think you're right. When you're talking about food security and things like that, then you could absolutely, and I would actually be interested to hear what gender experts have to say about how we control invasive species, because I'm sure there's something that I'm doing that's, maybe we are, leaving women out of the conversation when we shouldn't be.
That's a very interesting point, I think, that Eileen pointed out too. I think another issue that I've seen as well is the issue of environmental justice, and how a lot of these environmental problems are actually affecting those who are already marginalized or have other sort of setbacks. So that's an interesting point. And our next question from Lisa, how can we get support to save and propagate indigenous plants?
Oh, that's really, that's something, plants in Hawaii has a lot of endangered species that are plants. Because the islands are in the middle of the ocean, pretty much all the native Hawaiian plants are endemic to Hawaii, only found there. And there's not that many of them left because of the natural history of Hawaii, because a lot of the forests were cleared for cattle, and then there's invasive species, and there are a lot of people working to save endangered plants. And the main way you do that is collect seed, grow seedlings in a greenhouse, and then try to outplant your indigenous plants in places that they will do well. That's not, I'm making it sound a lot easier than it really is. And, finding money for that is, that's hard, because, so people that are into plants, we always kind of say that things like elephants, we call them charismatic megafauna. And we're always a little bit jealous, because we feel like the big animals, like the snow leopards and the pandas, everybody wants to save those, but often people don't think about plants. And so it can be hard to raise their profile. And get money to do the work that's necessary to save them. But, you know, the more people that are interested in plants and the more people that talk about it, then I think that will raise the profile with the people that have money, and then it'll be easier to find grants to save indigenous plants.
And the next question, we have 2 questions that are about soil. Basically asking, can you change the soil quality or control the soil quality to curb unwanted plants?
I haven't ever heard of that. I know there's a lot you can do. It's called integrated pest management. There's a lot you can do to help stop invasive species from growing, especially in agricultural settings where you have more control. I haven't ever heard of anyone being able to like change the pH of soil. But maybe that's something that could be investigated.
Yeah, maybe that's an idea for
that sounds like a master's degree to me.
Yeah, yeah. You're a PhD thesis. Yep.
Yeah. Exactly.
So another question: are all invasive species imported? Are there any domestic or?
Oh,
indigenous?
You know, that's interesting because in Hawaii we say yes. You know, it has to come. Like if it's a native Hawaiian species, then it's not invasive. It could cause problems, but that usually means that there's a problem with some other part of your environment, and that's why the species is doing something. I've noticed here that there are there's this tree called Dichrostachys cinerea that's a real problem on grasslands that's native to East Africa, but I guess it likes disturbed soil. So if there's a pasture that's overgrazed, it'll start growing. So I think when you say like from somewhere else though, right? Because like I said, Kenya has lots of different ecosystems. So, you know, you could say, well, this species is native to the coast, but we're going to move it up here and plant it outside a lodge at Mount Kenya. And maybe it becomes invasive because, I mean, essentially those are 2 different places. So it's probably best to, when you're thinking about whether something is native or invasive to a place, don't so much look at the political boundaries, but look at the ecosystem boundaries to decide whether or not it's exotic.
Thanks. And then we have another question asking about if there's a pattern of invasions or sort of based on the time or the climate.
Yeah, that's another PhD thesis right there. Well, I will say I put that slide up with the trade, with the shipping routes, because there is a lot of, the rate of introductions has increased as trade has increased. And I know like in the continental United States, like in the East and Midwest, like in the states of Michigan and Ohio, and like Pennsylvania and stuff, they are getting a lot of forest pests because there's so much trade from China, right? And those climates are similar. And, you know, whenever something is put into a container, it's put, they use these wooden pallets, right? To like store the plastic wrap packages. And you can have a pest on trees hiding in those wooden pallets because they're not treated. And then they come to the United States and they become invasive. So, so in that sense, I think, yeah, there is a pattern. There are so many papers where people are trying to figure out like, what is the biological trait that makes something invasive? And, you know, it's being able to grow fast, being able to have being able to exist in a lot of different types of climates, being able to disperse really well, those kind of things. So there are a lot of papers on that, but then there's always like this one plant that you're like, why is this invasive? Like that picture with the purple leaves, that species, that's called Myconia, it can only exist in areas that have over 1,800 millimeters of rainfall, which is a lot. Like, it has to be a rainforest. So it's been known to science since the 1800s. The British were trying to grow it in greenhouses and they couldn't even do it. And we all know that the British are really into gardening, right? Well, they were back in 1800 and they couldn't even grow it. And then you plant it in Hawaii and because it has like its habitat and it becomes invasive. So there are traits, but there's still sometimes things that surprise you.
We have another question from Baka Bonfas about the common water hyacinth. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Latin Mycomia crassipes, and it's an invasive species in Kenya. And he is asking, what do you think is the major limitation to its biological control in Kenya's freshwater lakes?
So I don't know that much about water hyacinth. That's something I need to research. I can say I watched a webinar last week on famine weed, Parthenium hysterophis. And, in Australia, they have found and released 10 different biocontrol organisms for Parthenium. And so it might be, if they've only released one biocontrol on that, it might be that they just need some more organisms. Sometimes it's not just one thing that will keep a plant in check. It might be also, I attended another webinar about a year ago, and in Colorado, peach farmers in Colorado, there's some kind of worm that destroys the peaches. And they have a biocontrol for it, but it has to be like reared and released once a year. So there's like a laboratory that raises wasps throughout the winter. And then the farmers come get them and like release them in their fields. And that's how, but they have to do it every year. So it doesn't, it won't reproduce enough on its own to keep down the pest. So that might be a problem too, in that you just have to keep re-releasing it because it's not reproducing well enough on its own.
Another question, this is an interesting question. Are there any challenges of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, hybridizing with invasive species and forming a sort of super invasive species? Is that even possible?
That's a good science fiction novel right there. I haven't heard of that. And there is some, like when I was saying that for plant diseases, there aren't, especially in wildland settings, there's not that many tools. Genetic modification is something that people are looking at. As far as I know, most GMO, most things that are genetically modified are agricultural plants. And I haven't heard of, something that is specifically grown for agriculture, hybridizing with like a wild plant that it's closely related to. It might be out there. It's just, I haven't come across that.
There's lots of good sort of research questions here to pursue. I think there's another similar question asking about using genetics to control invasive species. Has that been used, or is any research on that?
Yeah, I had put geneticists on the list of invasive species careers. So, there's a lot of invasive species that cannot be identified by just how it looks, especially with plant diseases. Like, there's a group of plant diseases called rust, and it's basically like this yellow or orange powder that you'd see on a plant. And the only way to identify what kind of rust you're dealing with is to do genetic analysis. And there's lots of other species like that. The forest pathogen that I had talked about that we dealt with in Hawaii, he was either in South Africa or Australia, I think, but there was one guy, he was the world's expert on Ceratocystis pathogens, and we had to send samples to him for him to identify it. And he was a geneticist, and he said, actually, this is a new species. I've never seen this before. So that was interesting. With respect to control, there is, like I said, with plant diseases, you can do things like genetically modify resistance to plant diseases in plants. That's something that people are really looking at and doing right now. Yeah, but I don't think, oh, there is something, it's not, I'm going to tell you this because it's super interesting. I don't know if they're doing it here in Kenya, but I know that the Gates Foundation is supporting the work in Hawaii. So I'm sure there must be some people doing it here in Kenya. But so in Hawaii, we have avian malaria. So we don't have human malaria, but we have avian malaria, and it's wiped out our native birds. So we have a few left. So what they're trying to do is there's this thing called Wolbachia. It's like a something that flies or that mosquitoes carry in them. And if you manipulate it, you can make mosquitoes sterile. And so they're trying to figure out how to do this. And they're going to get like this really tiny, tiny needle and raise mosquitoes that have this Wolbachia microbe in them, and then release them into the forest in the hopes that that will reduce the mosquito population and reduce the incidences of avian malaria. So that's not genetic at all. Like, it's actually a naturally occurring thing inside mosquitoes. But it's just an illustration of like it's like some new technology that could be really good, because then we don't have to use pesticides to get rid of mosquitoes. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but.
No, that's fascinating. I think that's exciting. I'm curious to see if that's something that they're doing here in Kenya. I wonder if anybody's heard of that. You can put in the comment section as well. And let us know if you've heard of that here. Another question about a plant found in the Nyanza region here in Kenya is the Lantata camara, which has become a menace. Have you heard of that plant, or do you have any information on how the efforts are to combat that plant?
Yeah, lantana, that's also in Hawaii. In the book that I was reading, they said that lantana was one of the worst weeds in Kenya. I think in Hawaii, they released a biocontrol on it a long time ago. So there might be a biocontrol available. But yeah, that one's hard. And I would imagine in order to get rid of it, it would be chainsaws and herbicide in order to get rid of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely an area of cooperation for Hawaii and Kenya, possibly.
Yeah, I think it's a problem. So the Australians are really good at biocontrol, so they probably have a biocontrol for it too.
So we have another question from Daniel about the methenge plant, which has caused deformation to animals and is dangerous to humans, and asking if that would be classified as an invasive species.
Absolutely. We have that one too. I once tried to chainsaw a bunch of Prosopis juliflora. And in Hawaii, we call it longthorn kiave. Yeah, that stuff is terrible. We had the field crew, we were trying to clear out a bunch of that stuff for a community on this little island. Everyone was bleeding at the end. It was so awful, not from the chainsaws, but from the plant. So let's see, you said, what would I propose the Kenyan government or activists do differently? I'm sorry, but that specific question, I would really want to think about it. I think it would be hard to, I'm not really sure, but that is a place where international cooperation could help, because I know it's a problem in Ethiopia. I know it's a problem I think it's a problem in Asia too, because for some reason, people thought that was a good plant to plant all over the world. I don't know why. But a lot of other countries have issues with that plant. And so you could definitely form like an international coalition. I know in Hawaii, they have really big machines that they use to get rid of it. These things that are called brush. They're basically like like a cross between a lawnmower and a bulldozer. And they go over it and then they have to go back and treat it with herbicide. So it's very labor intensive to get rid of it.
And speaking of herbicide, we have another question about chemical control. Someone's asking, what are the most common chemicals and their implications on the environment, and how safe are these chemicals that are being used to combat invasive species?
Oh, that's a great question. So I had on the list of careers, I had pesticide specialist. And so there was someone, or there is someone in Hawaii whose job it was they did research on which chemicals to use for which species and the lowest amount of chemical you could use to kill that species, and the best way to apply it so that you don't, inadvertently spray another plant or put it into the water system, something like that. So like this guy had actually invented, he had a way of injecting trees with herbicide. So if you were trying to control trees, you could just inject them and then you wouldn't have to worry about like spraying, other plants being accidentally sprayed with herbicide. So herbicide is definitely something that you need to be careful with. The most common chemicals that we used were glyphosate, which I know is controversial, and triclopyr, which is really good for woody species. Triclopyr is, at least from my understanding, seems pretty safe. There's different formulations of it, and you have to make sure that you're wearing eye protection and we call it PPE, personal protective equipment, when you're using herbicides. I know glyphosate has become very controversial, and I have the report from the World Health, or from the whatever that organization, the Cancer Research Center of the WHO, but I haven't read it yet. So I know, realistically, because we're working, most invasive species work, it's on isolated patches. And so the amount of herbicide you're using is nothing compared to what people use in agriculture, at least in the United States. So, and without herbicide, things aren't going to get controlled. So it's, yeah, but we try to use as little as possible.
And I think, so we're just nearing up to 11. Maybe I'll ask one more question. I have to say, I think the longer we're the more we're going, the longer the list of questions gets. So I'm sure we could spend like a whole nother hour in the list of questions that people are sending us. We'll keep growing. But maybe we'll end on this last question for you, Rachel, on the topic of public engagement. And so how do you measure public understanding of invasive species or appreciation of these threats posed by invasive species, or any other strategies you might want to consider or talk about for public engagement and public understanding?
Oh, that was something I struggled with when I was managing OIS, because how do you measure that? One of our partner organizations, they did a statewide public opinion survey where they asked questions like, do you know what invasive species are? Do you think they're a problem? They did some for certain campaigns that we were going to do. They actually had focus groups like they do in marketing. That was really interesting. Part of the way at OIS, we did not have the money to do public opinion surveys, but we kind of measured our public engagement by the percentage of private property owners that would let the field crew onto their property to survey. So we had, we had about 200 or 300 property owners every year that we would request to get onto their property to survey and control invasive species. And we had a 95% yes rate. So it was only 5% of people that said no. So that told us that people were concerned about invasive species because they would agree to let us come onto their property.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for this chat with us today. And thank you to everyone who submitted your questions and joined us for this hour. And thank you to Esther and the American Center for your cooperation. And so with that, I will hand it back over to Esther to close us out.
Thank you so much, Devin. Thank you, Rachel. Such a fascinating conversation to, have had on this exciting day, Earth Day. I wore green just for that. I'm so I'm so much more enlightened than I was at the start of this call to widen my understanding of invasive species, and I'm sure that's something that our audience have appreciated as well. You have displayed such great knowledge of your expertise on the area, on the study that you've made. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that it's really easy for us to draw some correlation between what you've experienced in Hawaii and what we've experienced in Kenya, and that's really fascinating for us to learn more about. I know we have more than 30 questions that came from the audience that we haven't quite gotten around to responding. I'm almost at a place where I'm asking Devin, do you want to poll the audience and see whether to have another conversation with you, Rachel, on another day and continue just learning more about invasive species? So because we have your emails, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, we'll definitely reach out to you. Rachel, if it's okay with you, I know someone asked if they could have a copy of your presentation. Is that something that you would be open to?
Yes, that's, of course, yes.
Great. I know we have audiences from across the country. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us today. It's at the top of the hour and we do want to recognize that we all have other things to get to, but I really appreciate you. American Spaces Kenya appreciates you and your time. So I want to wish you a very happy Earth Day. Remember to reduce, reuse, and recycle, and be a better human today and every day. Let's make Earth Day every day. So thank you, everybody. My name is Esther Kihanga, and I'm so glad that you made it today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.